Hello everyone, this is Toshihiko Amano, Baroque violinist and violin teacher based in Tokyo, speaking to you from this beautiful riverside in Hanno City, Saitama, Japan. An Italian luthier and gut string expert, Daniela Gaidano, has asked me to do a virtual interview with me on Violoncello da Spalla, which is a 5-string mini cello that you play on the shoulder. So today I'm going to visit a workshop of a wonderful luthier, Takumi Takakura, which is just over there, to borrow his beautiful Violoncello da Spalla, talk about my experience with the instrument, and demonstrate some very basic playing techniques. So let's go!
Hello, I'm Daniela Gaidano from Italy, and today I have a very special treat for you. An interview about Violoncello da Spalla with Toshihiko Amano, a Baroque violinist based in Tokyo, who extensively used the Violoncello da Spalla in his pandemic videos. Recently, a young student of him also acquired the Violoncello da Spalla, so I thought this was the best timing to ask him about technique aspects and teaching aspects of Violoncello da Spalla. So let's go ahead. Hello Toshi, how are you today?
Hello Daniela, thank you for inviting me to do this interview.
Hello Takumi, how nice to see you. Thank you for sharing your time with us.
Hello Daniela, nice to see you.
Takumi is now an old friend of mine. We first met during the musical proportion violin design training with Dmitry Badirov, and we both went ahead taking also the Violoncello da Spalla making training. Takumi, during his Italian studies, also had the opportunity to study the instruments of La Pietà in Venice, so the Vivaldi legacy. He's without any doubts someone who bases his making on first-hand research and deep knowledge. So I would like to ask you one question, Takumi. Is Violoncello da Spalla a Baroque instrument?
肩掛けチェロ、スパッラが、バロックの楽器かという意味で言うと、構造的には私たち博物館に行って直接楽器を調べてネックが釘打ちをされて付けられていることとか、構造的にはバロックの楽器で、時代的にも、ちょうどそのバッハが、いた時代に作られた楽器であるということが分かってはいるのですが、その釘打ち自体は実は現代でもバロック時代に限らずその後の時代も使われていたということが分かっていたりしますので、それだけをとってもうバロック音楽に限定される楽器というふうには今はもう言えないのかなというふうに考えております。また弦も当時はガットを使った弦がそれしかなかったと思いますが、現代ではさまざまなメーカーが弦を開発しており、モダン弦も当然出てはいますので、決してバロック時代の音楽だけに限らず、本当に現代に至るまでのいろいろなそのレパートリーの音楽を楽しめる楽器になっているのではないかというふうに私は思います。ダニエラが最初に紹介をしてくれたように私たちはプロポーションを学ぶグループの中で知り合ったんですが、この肩掛けチェロというこれまでほとんど多分皆さんもご覧になったことがない、私たち制作者もそんな楽器を作ったことがないという楽器がちゃんとその楽器として成立するためには、楽器がそもそもどういうそのプロポーションを持って作られているのか、ネックの長さに対してボディのその幅であったり全長であったりがどのような比率で作られていなければならないのか、そういうことが背景にあるということです。で、それによってしっかりその楽器がもう機能するものとして設計され作られていくことからさまざまな時代の音楽を楽しめるものになっていくのかなというふうに思っています。
Thank you so much. Going back to Toshi, would you like to share with us your story with Violoncello da Spalla?
I tried the Violoncello da Spalla for the first time in 2009. Back then, my friend Dmitry Badirov lived in Japan, and one day he invited me over to his place to try the Violoncello da Spalla he made. My first experience with the Violoncello da Spalla was a mixture of good and bad. It was good because the range of the instrument is close to my voice range, and since it's held or hang close to my chest or my lungs, I felt as if the instrument was singing on my behalf. I'm not a good singer, so it was a nice feeling. It was bad simply because it was just too big for me to handle. The biggest problem for me was my left hand. Up to my third finger was okay, but I didn't know how I could possibly reach the next note in tune without hurting my pinky. Dima played some movements from Bach's cello suites and made it look so easy, but I kept telling myself, of course he can play it, because he's taller and has bigger hands, but this is not for me. Now, don't get me wrong, his instrument was beautifully made and sounded wonderful. It's just that I wasn't ready for it. Shortly after that, Dima moved to the Netherlands, and there weren't very many people with Violoncello da Spalla in Japan, so I had no access to the instrument to give it another try. Then, 10 years later, in 2019, I happened to come across an Instagram page of Takumi, and I found out that he was a colleague of Dima's, and he had just opened this workshop, and had just finished making his first Violoncello da Spalla, which is this one. So the very next day I got in touch with him and came here to try this beautiful instrument. To my surprise, it didn't feel as big and difficult as I had felt 10 years before, even though the size of this instrument is very much similar to the one Dima made. It's probably because of my experience with a fairly large viola I had been using for several years. From then on, I started visiting this workshop to practice the instrument for fun. I've also brought my friends here to try it out. Sometimes I'd rent this instrument to practice at home, play the continuo line for my students during their private lessons, and use it for ensemble lessons with my students. It's wonderful to be able to play the bass line in the right register and the feeling of the harmony being built above me, which is something you don't experience as a violinist. It's just delightful. Then came 2020 and of course the COVID pandemic. Since I was left with so much free time with all the concerts and many lessons cancelled, I decided to make a good use of the time by making more frequent visits to this workshop to practice Bach's cello suites on Violoncello da Spalla, which is something I had never even dreamed of doing in this life. It was when everyone started making multi-screen music videos at home, and I decided to jump on the bandwagon by recording all the parts of pieces of music all by myself, using my violin and viola and his Violoncello da Spalla. Later, I applied that makeshift video editing skill to do virtual lessons with my students, both private and ensemble. And just like that, my students and I survived the COVID home quarantine period. All of this wouldn't have been possible if it hadn't been for Takumi's Violoncello da Spalla. So basically, it saved my life.
You already played quite a wide range of da braccio family instruments, violin, viola and lira da braccio. Could you comment on the playability of Violoncello da Spalla? Was it harder to get to a professional level, and is it hard to maintain it?
Yes, I do play the medieval fiddle and the Renaissance lira da braccio. In fact, last year in 2021, Takumi organized a concert in which I play these da braccio instruments of different sizes, along with my violin and his Violoncello da Spalla, within the course of less than 2 hours. multiple languages within a short space of time. I spent a very intense month preparing for this concert, making sure they're in different boxes in my brain, if you know what I mean. And I became more proficient with each of these instruments than ever before. None of them is easier or harder than the others, just like when you're learning any instruments, or languages for that matter. It takes time and takes a lot of getting used to.
How did you feel it plausible or not? Did it feel like something that could really be?
I'm not a musicologist, so I'm not in a position to say whether this type of instrument ever existed historically or not. But this instrument works for me, and musicians in the 17th or 18th century, for example, surely would and must have enjoyed using it as much as I do, so why not?
Which characteristic do you think a bow for Violoncello da Spalla must have?
I think it really depends on the player, the instrument, and the strings. I have different types of bows for my violin. Some are very light and the others are heavier. Some are softer and the others are stiffer. One of the stiffer bows made of snakewood works the best for me. It's agile but stiff and dense enough to dig into the thick double wound G and C strings, but light enough to have a clean, relaxed sound out of the gut E string.
Do you use Violoncello da Spalla while teaching or only to perform?
I do use it when I teach once in a while, but not regularly. I teach violin and it's easier to show things to my students on the violin. But whenever I do use it, it helps my students to feel and understand the harmonic progression of the piece they are playing. In fact, many of my students ask me to accompany them on the Violoncello da Spalla for their recitals, and I always agree to do it with pleasure.
What did you enjoy the most playing with it?
I have not explored enough repertoire to answer this question, but for the concert last year, which I just talked about, I played Bach's Cello Suite No. 1 and Vivaldi's Cello Sonata No. 6, and I enjoyed playing both of them.
So I know you are now having an experience also teaching it, as you have a very young student, Kai, who recently bought a Violoncello da Spalla from Takumi. Could you describe us the learning curve that one can expect when starting with it?
Once again, it really depends. Just like some people pick up a language quicker than the others, some people get the hang of this instrument just like that. I teach a wonderful violin student named Kai, who is only 13 years old. 3 years ago, he was so small that he could barely hold this instrument. But now he's not only tall, but talented enough to play it well, only after a few weeks of experience on this instrument. And it's quite extraordinary to see his learning curve skyrocket. I myself, on the other hand, am a slow learner, so I've had to dedicate myself to practice this instrument for days, weeks, and months, and even now I'm still learning and struggling. But like I said, I have a fairly large viola, and that prepared my left hand for the string length of Violoncello da Spalla. So if you're a violinist like myself, I would recommend that you try the viola before trying the Violoncello da Spalla.
A suggestion not to be discouraged after the first week.
I used to think this instrument is not for me, and it took me 10 years to be convinced that maybe I can play this. So don't give up. It takes time, patience, and perseverance to get used to this instrument, and the instrument needs to get used to you. The more time you spend with it, the more familiar it gets, and trust me, it's rewarding.
Thank you.